Hello, this is Quinn Wildman from Embarcadero. I work in developer support, worked there for a really long time, and today we're going to talk about InterBase tips and tricks about getting connected to InterBase in any way you could possibly think of. I kind of thought about all the different ways you might really want to do it, and it's like 50 or 60. We're not going to do all those, but we're going to see, hopefully get you enough ideas here that, because once you get going, everything is exactly the same. Okay, so first we're going to talk about where InterBase runs and what you need to make connectivity. So as you can see here, InterBase runs as 32-bit and 64-bit, and runs as a desktop only. So that would be just local connections, nothing else. A server, and then IB Lite and InterBase to go. Then you can run it on Linux as a 32-bit and 64-bit server. The 64-bit server is new. On Mac, you could run it as IB Lite or IB to go, and then iOS and Android mobile platforms, you've got IB Lite and IB to go. Okay, to make a connection, you need a client. So on Windows, if you're doing 32-bit, that's gds32.dll or ib2go.dll. If you're doing a 64-bit application, that's ibclient64.dll or ib2go64.dll. On Linux, that's going to be gds.so, and on Mac, there's a client there, libgds.dylib or ib2go.dylib, and then on Android, it really gets embedded, but ultimately the file is libib2go.a. Now, what we're going to see is all these files really, if you use the deployment manager, all these files all happen automatically. So you don't really need to think about these file names. But ultimately, as you're going along, you might think about what file is really happening here? What do I need? And that might kind of make sense if you ever have problems deploying something. Okay, you're going to need a driver along the way. So the one we, of course, recommend these days is FireDAC. InterBase Express is also very good. DB Express, a little bit older, but it works well. InterBase also comes with a .NET driver. We're not going to talk about that today. I'm going to show you a link to it, but that is included with InterBase, so I've mentioned it. We're going to talk about ODBC briefly here today. InterBase comes with a JDBC driver. Again, we're not going to talk about that today, but I've mentioned it because it is included with InterBase. Recently, we've had something written about how to connect with Python. I'm going to just give you a link to that. You could connect with PHP, or for your old diehards, of course, you could connect with the Borland Database Engine /PHP. Okay, you're going to need a client application to make a connection. So we are going to see ISQL today. We're going to see GSEC today. These other things are command line tools that are included with InterBase. We're going to see IB Console today. That's the InterBase Graphical User Interface Utility to connect. We're going to see ODBC. Typically, that's used with reporting tools. Now, we're not going to do a reporting tool. We're just going to see how to connect an ODBC connection. And then finally, we're going to use RAD Studio and see a little bit of code and do that in FireDAC and InterBase Express. Okay, this is an old connectivity diagram that I found in the past, but it still kind of makes sense. You might think about the Borland Database Engine, kind of take that out and put in FireDAC, okay? And everything else kind of still makes sense. Now, this, of course, this drawing here, it was made in the 32-bit world. So you would have a parallel instead of having, and of course, it's only Windows only. But you could have, all this gives you the idea of how you're connecting and what files are necessary. So finally, what do we need to connect? Okay, we need an InterBase product that's running and licensed. Now I've put running in quotes here because running typically would mean an InterBase server, but with the case of IB Lite, really that's just a DLL that you're deploying with your application. But it still has to be licensed. Of course, you need a username and password. Of course, the defaults for InterBase are the username sysdba and the password is master key. That's what we're going to use today. We need an InterBase client. We've seen some of those. We need a database file. That database file has to be on the same file system that InterBase resides. We're going to use the employee sample database for all the examples today. And then you need something that uses all those things, like ISQL or IB console or ODBC or something like that. Okay, so now we're going to look at a number of examples of how to do all these things. So first thing you need to kind of know is, where is InterBase running? So I've got actually 2 InterBase servers running on my computer right here. This is the default one. You'll notice that it says GDS_DB. That's an InterBase 64-bit server. And using all the defaults, the GDS_DB indicates all the defaults. And then here's another server I've got running installed someplace else. And you can see that it has a different name here, XE7_64A. So that's something you do with multi-instance. You can see that both of these are running, okay? And so now what we're going to do is we're going to use the ISQL command line tool to do this. Okay, so now what I've got, we're going to use a bunch of batch files to see how this all works. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use startup.bat. Okay, the first thing you need to do to make a connection is you need a path to where ISQL is. So the first thing that I've done there is I've used the cd command to change directory to the bin folder below where InterBase is installed. Next thing we're going to do is just do a path there. You'll notice I'm using the cd environment variable there, which is just reflects the current directory. Okay, so now we've got the bin folder in our path. Then we set 2 environment variables for ISC user and ISC password. And then the next thing we're doing is optional, but I'm setting the InterBase environment variable. Now, the one thing that's important here, you'll notice in the comments here, this isn't required. Now, you may notice in RAD Studio, when we look at RAD Studio a little bit, that RAD Studio sets this. You may or may not want that, okay? But that's just an example here. So this says, where is InterBase running? Where is it using if I'm going to do a local connection? And then that IB protocol, which you can see, that's the label name. What instance of InterBase do I want? So again, you don't have to set that for a local connection. If you're using multi-instance, you would. Okay, so now we're going to just run startup.bat. Okay, and in the end there, what that did is that changed to a directory where I have my database. This is just the InterBase sample directory, okay? And it has a bunch of batch files that I've created here. And these are all kinds of different connectivity examples. And so we're going to look at each one of these examples and see what they do. Okay, so this is just a simple example. What this does is it's running ISQL. It's going to connect to the employee.gdb database, which is in the current directory. All of our examples, that -i stands for input. Okay, it means give us the input of the sv.txt file, and then -e means echo everything that's in the sv.txt file. So let's see what's in that. So all that does is has 2 lines. It says show version and says show country table. Country is one of the tables in the employee sample database. And show version just tells us a bunch of version information about how we connected. So this is going to be a local connection using the database that's in the current directory. And so there we can see that this connected, and the version is this is a version 12.04. It's an ODS 16 database. Okay, so now let's look at number 2. Okay, so now this is going to connect via a complete path. Okay, so this would be the case where the database isn't in the current directory. In this case it is, but maybe your application you wouldn't know that it is. So you give a complete path to it. Again, this is a local connection that's only allowed by InterBase Desktop, which is what is running here. And notice that gave us exactly the same results. Okay, now this one is a little tricky here. You'll notice that this says connect to a database called EMP. Now, what the heck is EMP? Okay, EMP is actually an alias that I've created. So this is a simple little batch file. But basically what this does is this is using the gset command line tool, and it says, hey, is imp already there? If it is, I'm going to delete it, and then I'm going to add it back in. Okay, so we'll run add alias. Okay, and in the end, that deleted our alias because I know it's there, and it re-added it back in. The last line is really the important line there. You'll notice it says alias-add, and that's creating our emp alias. And then where's the path to my database? That's the path to employee.gdb. You can also do this with IB console. We're going to see how to do this with IB console in just a few minutes here. So now that's number 3. And you'll notice number 3 looks pretty much just like 1 and 2. Okay, but that emp, that could be really convenient because we can have emp anywhere. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to connect via TCP/IP. Okay, so now we have a server called ETS Patterson. Okay, and then we got a path to our database just like we had before. So now we are connecting to some server out there in the magical land called ETS Patterson. Okay, so now look at our show version. Gave us a little bit of different information. Okay, and so now we can actually see that that is a InterBase 64-bit server that we connected to, and we connected to it via TCP/IP, and then we've got a local client as well. Okay, let's look at number 5. Okay, so now this one is very similar to the last one. So now we're connecting to that. So now we're going to use TCP/IP again, but now we're going to give the computer name of localhost. That's the computer we have right here. And then the instance name you'll see is the instance that you see in the server manager right there in the middle of your screen. Okay, and you'll notice now that in this case we connected to an InterBase 64-bit server. Okay, and so now let's look at which one are we on? We're on 6. Okay. Okay, so now that last connection, we gave an alias name before, and you can also give which actually depends on your services file. You can also give a port number. So that XE7_64A, that really says that InterBase server is running on port 3071. Okay, it looks just like the last one. Okay, here's another one. Let's do number 7. Okay, and so now here before we were using localhost, now we're going to do a computer name and give the port number. Okay, let's look at number 8. Okay, and then really similar to the last one, where we're giving the server name and a port. Okay, now let's go on to 9. Okay, so now in this example here, what we're doing is we're actually, notice in this case, again, using TCP/IP, using the port alias, but in this case, we're using emp instead of the file name. Okay. Okay. You can also connect using an IP address. Okay, so in this example, we're actually connecting to a Linux 64-bit server. In this particular case, I know its IP address, and so we're going to give that, and then we give to the path to that database. That path is a little bit different than we've been seeing, but again, it's just the path to the database. Okay, and you'll notice that now show version showed us a little bit different, but now we can see now that that is a Linux 32-bit server that we connected to. And finally, okay, in this case, we're going to connect to a Linux 64-bit server. In this particular case, I know the name of the server. Just like the last connection, only instead of giving an IP address, now we're going to give a server name, and now we'll see a Linux 64-bit server connection. Okay, and you can see show version showed that it was 64-bit. Okay, so now let's do all the same thing, pretty much the same, with IB console. Okay, so here we've got, so the way you create a new connection, I've got a bunch created, but we'll just see how we create one real quick. We say add, say local or server. So local would be for desktop, remote would be for using something using TCP/IP. Okay, and then here we've got the server name, just like you saw before, and we've got a label name if we want to do that. Typically GDSDB again, as we've been doing, and then an alias name you can give. So that's kind of how we go through and do it manually. But let's look at some of the examples that I've created here. And you should notice they all look very similar to what we just did with ISQL. Again, the idea being that once you know how it works, you can do it all. You can do it anytime you want. So in this case, it's a local server. Okay, and so really, because it's local, it doesn't really need to know much. Okay, we did have that GDS_DB because you could have many local ones with GDS_DB if you wanted to. So let's connect here. And there's, of course, where we provide our username and password. And there we're connected. Okay, and so now we've got two connections here that I've created. Okay, again, we could create a new one by doing add. So here you have to give the file name. This is where you could create an alias if you want to. Okay, so that's where the alias comes in. But here, let's connect, and we see it got connected. And now, what are the properties of that? And notice that the file name is just imp. That's that alias name that we gave before. It didn't give a full path name to it, so it's already been defined, and there we used it. Now let's look at this one. Let's connect here. And see, for this one, the file name we gave was a complete path to the file, just like one of the examples we had with ISQL. So we got it connecting with a full path, and we've got it connected with an alias. IB console, I guess if the database was in the same directory as IB console, which would be pretty unlikely, you could just give a file name. Okay, so let's disconnect here. And let's look at a Linux 32 connection. So you notice in this one, now in this case, we are giving connecting via IP address, just like you saw in the example before. Okay, and let's connect here. Okay, and there we have a connection to a Linux 32-bit server. Okay, we're going to connect to that same employee database that we've been connecting to. And so in this case, we gave that complete path to that file name if we wanted to. Okay, looks just pretty much similar like to what we did before, only we've got a different path because that path on the server is a little different. Okay, and now let's connect to, we have two Linux 64-bit connections. Let's look at them both. Okay, this one we're giving it a IP address. Okay, and here's our database. I think this is going to look just like we did before. It's going to give the file name. Same file name we had before. And now we have a second Linux 64-bit connection. And so in this one, we're giving the computer name. So we have a 64-bit connection with a computer name and a 64-bit connection with the IP address. And I think our path to our database looks just the same as we've been seeing. Yep, same path to that database. Okay, a couple more. Okay, this is to that local server now that's using TCP/IP. So in this case, I gave it an IP address, and here notice that we've got a different port alias for that. Okay, and so now these are going to look just like we had before. Notice how we've given the file name as emp. Emp is just that alias that we created. And here we've got the complete path to the file name. And let's see here, Windows Remote one. Okay, that's ETS Patterson that we saw before. Okay, and we'll connect here. Again, complete path to the file name again. And then our last one, Windows Remote 2. Okay, so now we've got a different server here. And notice in this particular case, we've given a port alias. And so instead of giving a label, now we've given that port of 3071. Okay, and so now let's go off and let's go look at how we might do the same thing with ODBC. Okay, so with ODBC, the one thing with ODBC you might think about is there is a 32-bit and there is a 64-bit ODBC administrator. And so you have they can be separate. And here we're running the 64-bit ODBC administrator. That's the default shortcut in Control Panel. If you want to run the 32-bit one, you're going to have to run that manually, and that's in the Windows/syswow64 directory, and that's just ODBC add 32.exe. But the interface for either one looks exactly the same. Okay, so you would normally we're going to look at a couple I've created, but normally you would just click add. You would pick the InterBase ODBC driver, and you would enter a name and then a database that we're going to see, and this is the username and that's the password. So let's look at some, and these should look exactly the same like you've already seen. Okay, here's Linux 32-bit. Okay, and you notice here what we've got is we've got IP address and the name of the database, and we'll test that connection. That worked. And we'll do a 64-bit one. Okay, so here we've got the IP address and the name of the file. And now we're going to do the Linux 64-bit second one. Okay, so in this one, we don't have the IP address. We've got the name of the computer. And now we're going to do a local path. So this would be the way you'd use an InterBase desktop connection. And notice we've just got the path, the big long path to the database, the same as we've already done twice before. And let's see, what else do we have left? Oh, okay. So here's an example where in this particular case, I gave a server name / the alias name and the port alias, and then you notice we've got that imp name again. So just another example of how you might do it. You've already seen that before. And now let's go off and got a couple more examples here. Okay, so this is doing TCP/IP on this computer, and last time we gave a port alias. This time we're giving the port number. And one last one, and now this particular case, this is an InterBase server running somewhere else. And so that's the same server we saw before, SV Patterson, and our path to our database. And there we go. Okay, so we've seen ODBC, we've seen ISQL, and now we're going to go into RAD Studio. Okay, so in RAD Studio, you can use the Data Explorer to create a connection. Again, all these connections are going to look very similar to you. They can say add a new connection. Okay, you give a connection name. And then you get a bunch of properties. And we're going to look at the properties for a bunch of existing ones that I've already created here. Okay, so this is our local connection. Okay, and notice again using just that imp alias. Okay, and we'll test that. That worked. Okay, here's our Linux 32-bit example. Okay, and so we've got here's our server, and there's the path to our database. So we're using by IP address this time. Okay, now Linux 64-bit. Okay. Now, notice I've changed this just a little bit. You remember with ISQL, ultimately what we did is we entered the server name colon the path to database. So what really Database Explorer is doing is it's concatenating those things together for you. So if you want to, you can just ignore the server name and enter the database name completely. And in fact, there are some places where, for example, if you're using IB Lite, it doesn't give you an example for a server, so you can just do it this way. Now, using IB Lite, you can only do that if you have the Enterprise Edition or you have the FireDAC add-on. You need one of those to make a remote connection using IB Lite. And we're going to see that in just a moment. So now here's another, oh, did we make a connection there? We'll just do one here. Okay, and so now this one, notice we've given the server name and the path to database. Okay, here is our local server. So notice, so in this case, we've given localhost, so it's using TCP/IP on this computer, and it has given we're giving the port alias in this example, path to database. And now we're going to see a Linux 32-bit connection. Okay, notice again that this example doesn't have a server name. It just has the IP address at the beginning. Okay, Windows Remote Server first example. Okay, so here we see here's the ETSVS Patterson. That's the server. There's the path to our database. Okay, another remote server example. Okay, in this particular case, the server is running on my local computer, but we're going to give the port number instead. Okay, and we've got a complete path to the database. Okay, and one last remote server one. Okay, and this one is using some server called ngyrn-64. That's my code name for never give your real name. And then path to database. And here we've given the port here instead. Okay, so that's another way to give the port. There we go. Okay, now we've used just the InterBase one. Let's use the IB Lite one. Okay. Now here we're using, so IB Lite can connect to a remote database. You can connect to a local database, or you can connect to a remote database. Again, you'd have to have the Enterprise Edition or the FireDAC add-on to do that. Okay, notice there is no server option here. So in this case, we just gave the database name, we gave the IP address in this particular example, and then the path to the database. We should look at one other thing that FireDAC gives you. You can also see all kinds of info about how we connected. Okay, so a lot of that stuff that we did with show version with ISQL, you can see that right here. Okay, now we're going to make a Linux 64-bit connection. Okay, and again, we're going to give the IP address. Okay, path to database. Okay. Could have given the name of the server there also. And then finally, a local connection. So this is an example of really IB Lite now being a server. The other ones, it was an example where it was being a client. So you wouldn't need special licensing for this type of example. So in this case, this we've got is a path to database, and that's it. There we go. Okay, so now that we've done all that, how do we use it? Okay, so I'm gonna show you an example here that does all this, but we're gonna get just the basic foundation of how you might use all this. So we're gonna do this as a multi-device application, but you could easily do the same thing for VCL. VCL would be very similar. Okay, so we'll take our Linux 64-bit connection, we'll drag it over here, and let's pick a table where all the examples I've been doing have been using the country table. There's the country table. We'll use the visual. We'll bind it visually. And give us some space here. Made active, and there we go. So we're gonna see an example now here, and really that's all I did. All I did to do that, is to do just what you saw there. Okay, so now we're going to look at two simple Delphi examples that we could build that put it all together. First, recall how we had the example at the beginning where we were looking at the version information. This is how you could see the version information that we saw with ISQL. Okay, so this is a really simple example. It uses the server properties component, and it just has 4 lines of code. I'm going to show you something, and I'm going to give you a link to this example here. But really, all this does is just shows you the version information. Let's make sure that we're going to build this for Windows. I think it is. Yep. Okay, and let's run that. So we could pick a couple different servers here. Okay, that is a Linux 64-bit server. And there's a Linux 64-bit server. Okay. Okay, and let's look at one more Delphi example. Now I'm going to, this one has a bunch of code in it that we're not going to have time to look at. But the idea being here that there's there's the driver we can pick. We saw the different drivers that we could pick when we ran the Database Explorer. Okay, here's the server. Okay, and here's the database. Okay, and then we've got the username and password built into the FD connection. So here's our FD connection. Notice it's going to set this driver ID to whichever we want. It's going to set the database. The username and password are already set. Okay. Now this example, I'm going to just simply show it on Windows, but this example could run exactly the same on any platform. So if you ran this example, you could, for example, you could if you had the FireDAC drivers, or you had the Enterprise Edition, you could be an application running on iOS or on Android, debugging on Windows, and connected to a Linux server. It all works just the same any of those ways. But we'll just look to see how this works real quick here. Okay, and so here's we could do IB Lite or IB. You notice we've got a bunch of servers now. Not every single combination would be valid. Okay, not every single database combination would be valid. For example, we couldn't pick this for our local database. Okay, but so here we'll just do IB Lite, and we'll do that database, and we'll say connect. And there we just connected to a Linux server using the IB Lite driver. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is about licensing. That's the one thing that a lot of times that people get confused with using IB Lite. So we're going to look at that, just how the licensing works. So when you buy RAD Studio, this is the order confirmation email you get. Okay, it really has all the information you need. Okay, so the important parts are you go here to register your product, which we're going to do in just a second, and then here are instructions to do it. Okay, so let's look at that real briefly. So ultimately, that takes you to this page you have right here. I've already put in my serial number, put in my registration code. Now, if it doesn't know who you are, the next thing it's going to do is it's going to prompt you for a login name. It already has my cookie set, so it's not going to prompt me for that. Click Next. Okay. Notice there's a license agreement up here that you're agreeing to. Okay. Let's see. And it says basically by doing all the stuff below, you agree to that. And you can either do download or you can do email. You click register. And in the end, you get a file. Okay. Now I got a file. What do I do with it? Okay. Okay. What you're going to do is you're going to save it as either reg_iblite.txt, or you're going to save it as reg_ib2go.txt if it was InterBase to go. Okay. And you save it to your IB Register folder. Now, what the heck is your IB Register folder? I can tell where your IB Register folder is. Tools, Options, We're on environment options, and we're going to go to environment variables. Okay, and there is your IB register variable. That's where you put it. Okay, and the other thing you should notice here is I do not have settings for InterBase and IB protocol. You should look at your IDE. You might have those set. And remember how we had those set right at the beginning of our talk for iSQL? You may or may not want those. Okay. Now, how do we see where that file is? Okay. What you want to do is look at a deployment. You look at a deployment here. And what you can do is you can say add featured files. And here, notice I've added InterBase to go. I've added the InterBase client. Okay. And now if we look at all the files here, we'll see reg iblight.txt. I've already copied that. I have not copied reg ib2go.txt. Okay, that wraps things up. We're going to look at a few references here just to see some of the things we looked at real briefly. This is, we're going to have a link to this in a second. This is the licensing page that talks more about licensing InterBase to go. This is a little tutorial I wrote on using the command line tools. Remember we talked about how there was a .NET driver. Stephen Ball has written a tutorial on using the .NET driver using Visual Studio. This is something from the doc wiki that talks about showing the server version that we saw. And then here's an article about using InterBase and Python. Okay, and here's all our references. So that's to register IB-Lite to go. We just saw that. The doc wiki about setting up IB-Lite to go. The doc wiki about doing the server properties that we just saw. The Visual Studio connection via .NET. I'm going to have everything you saw here on my blog on the community. There's the command line tools tutorial. And then if you want to get a hold of me, find me on our news groups. I'm a frequent contributor there. Go to forums.embarcadero.com. And then I work in support. If you have an installation or a registration case, go to support.embarcadero.com, let forums, create a case. And if it's an InterBase case, almost certainly I'll get it. Or if it's something else, you might get me. And now I look forward to hearing from you in the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thanks, Quinn. A question here. If I have changed passwords of the DBA but lose it, so if it's no longer sysdba master key, is there a method to get control again, or is a reinstallation with loss of data the only way to recover?
So passwords are assuming you're not using end-user authentication. That would be EUA. Passwords are stored in the security database. That's admin IB by default. What you'd really want to do is just go back to the admin.ib. You'd be back to all the defaults, so that would be the one user sysdba master key. You'd lose all your users, but the data in your database would remain exactly the same, unchanged.
Okay. The moral of the story, though, is back up your passwords. Know what your
back up your security database.
Yeah, and don't forget your passwords.
Right.
Writing passwords in clear text in startup files or setup files, like you showed, is generally a bad idea. Is there a way to hide it as asterisks, etc.?
In a batch file? No, you couldn't hide it in the batch file. I mean, if you're really worried about that sort of thing, you'd obviously want to do it in a client application. Do it in your RAD Studio or your Delphi application, and of course, there it's not going to be a clear text.
What are the differences between FireDAC and IBX in regards to using InterBase?
Repeat the question one more time, Jim.
What are the differences between FireDAC and IBX in regards to using InterBase?
Oh, FireDAC and IBX. I see. They're really very similar. The way I like to think about it is IBX is InterBase all the way, baby. I'm in 100%. That's the only thing I'm ever going to use. Okay, but whereas FireDAC is cross database. So you're thinking, I'm going to use InterBase today, I'm going to use Oracle tomorrow, then use FireDAC. If you're going to InterBase all the way, then I like IBX myself. The company direction is FireDAC. Both are great solutions.
And then actually, if you wanted to use like some of the advanced FireDAC features like local SQL, you could still use that on top of IBX.
That's right. I mean, there are some things. Both FireDAC has some things that IBX doesn't have. IBX has some things that FireDAC doesn't have. The FireDAC things are going to be non-specific InterBase things, but local SQL, just like you mentioned, Jim, wouldn't be there with IBX.
Yeah, so you can mix and match too.
Macros, that's another thing that FireDAC offers.
Yep. What are database backup options when working with InterBase?
Okay, backup. So first of all, you can do a live backup, so your database can be running while you're backing up. The most common way of doing a backup would be a command line. That would be using GBack. You could also use IB Console to basically do the same thing if you wanted to. You could use it's called the I'm forgetting about what it. There's an IBX tool to do it. The Services API. That's the word I was looking for. Services the API. So there's actually a component in IBX to do it. So now backups traditionally are a full backup, but using GBack you could do incremental backups as well. Or using IB Console or using the Services API. Any of those you could do incremental backups.
Okay. So all of them do.
Yep.
Okay, very cool. All right. Well, great, Quinn. I think the questions are winding down here. If anybody's got any other questions, go ahead and put them in the questions panel and go to webinar, and we'll get Quinn to answer them for you here. Lots of great information here. Everybody can check out your blog post here, InterBase and Python Part of 3 for the new Python driver for InterBase. That's exciting. And were your sample code available on here?
They're not there yet, but they're going to be. Yeah. So I did create the blog entry should be there on blogs, but it says something like submissions coming or something like that. So that link should be live right now, but there's nothing there. So in the next week or something, basically everything you've seen today. I kind of wanted to see if there were any comments in the Q&A that I needed to change before we uploaded it.
Okay. Yep, I see it. So it says the blog's CodeRage 2015 source would be the blog post. So check out that blog post, and Quinn will have his source code up there shortly. Okay, a couple more questions came in here. What is the typical max transactions per second for InterBase?
I'm not going to have any good numbers on that one.
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, I mean, max transactions. It really depends on, how fast is your computer? Probably how complex is your transaction? Probably. That sounds like something that would be a good discussion for our news groups, and I'm thinking we could probably have a large discussion of that. And across, also, is your transaction across the network? Is it local?
Yeah.
I don't have any magic numbers.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. There probably is no way you could actually say for sure.
That's right. You could.
That's always the problem with benchmarks.
That's right. Probably the best thing is to say talk to other developers and see what type of response time they're getting for their application.
So if you have a InterBase database that has activity every second for a 24/7 basis, can you do a live backup then, or do you have to stop it to back it up?
You can always back it up while it's running. Okay. Now that's going to be something called a snapshot. Okay. So we start the snapshot right now at what time is it? 10:50 Pacific time. Okay. That backup ended, 11 o'clock. Okay. Everything that happened after 10 o'clock wouldn't be in that backup.
Right.
After 10:50 when it started. So it's a snapshot.
That's really cool, though, to be able to do that.
And that's been there forever.
So Joe who asked about the max transaction said, assuming multi-core and a simple SQL, there's still not any good way to measure that, I don't think, as far as
we don't do benchmarks. You could probably have one person, I think, that's what their job did, is to do that. And I've heard some companies, they have people that do that, but we don't.
Because it, just depending on how many records in the database or how wide's the database, how wide's the table.
I mean, there are standards out there, I know, that says really you run this standard and you have to pay, I think, a lot of money to belong to that committee or whatever it is, and you have to run the exact test to do it. But the end is we don't have numbers.
Yeah, so it could be benchmarked, I guess, but we don't have that. But yeah, okay. Well, fantastic, Quinn. Thank you for putting this session together. We actually just right before the Q&A started, Quinn was talking about it was pretty hectic getting this all put together, which it frequently is for preparing these.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a lot of work. So we appreciate it.